Absolutely. Prince Louis making his debut on the balcony. That's a very lovely sight. Duchess of Cambridge just holding him close, and very sweet little outfit, which looks very...
It didn't start with a headline. It started with a moment so raw, so unfiltered, that even the walls of the palace couldn't contain it. Because behind the carefully polished image of royalty, behind the rehearsed smiles and perfectly timed waves, something cracked. And at the center of it all was an 11-year-old boy who suddenly realized that power means nothing when someone you love is hurting. Because this wasn't just another quiet royal update. This wasn't one of those vague statements the palace releases to calm the public. This was something deeper, something heavier, a moment that insiders are now whispering about in hushed tones. The day Prince George stopped being just the future king and became something else entirely. A brother scared. You see, when the news about Prince Louis's health quietly settled into the Cambridge household, it didn't explode. It didn't create chaos. It created silence. The kind of silence that lingers in the air, heavy and suffocating, where every word suddenly feels too big, too permanent to say out loud. And that's when William and Catherine made a decision that reportedly stunned even senior staff. They didn't hide it. No half-truths, no softened version, no carefully edited story. They sat their children down and they told them everything. And right there in that private room, the illusion shattered. George didn't react like a prince. He didn't sit still with practiced composure. He didn't nod politely like he's been trained to do in public. No, he leaned forward, his eyes locked, absorbing every word like it mattered more than anything else in the world. Because to him, it did. What does this mean? Is he going to be okay? Can it get worse? The questions came fast, sharp, precise, not like a child guessing, but like someone trying to solve something impossible, like someone trying to fight a battle he couldn't even see. And then came the moment no one in that room was prepared for. Because George, the quiet one, the composed one, the boy who had already mastered the art of holding himself together in front of cameras, broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, painfully, real. Tears that he didn't try to hide. Tears that didn't belong in a palace, but somehow felt more powerful than anything that ever had. And that's when everything changed. Because in that instant, he wasn't thinking about the throne or duty or the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. He was thinking about his little brother. And here's the part no one is saying out loud. That moment, it wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, far more transformative, because what George experienced in that room wasn't just fear. It was helplessness. And for someone raised to believe, at least subconsciously, that responsibility comes with control, that realization hits differently. Because suddenly, there was something he couldn't fix, something he couldn't protect Louis from. And insiders say that realization hit him hard because George has always been protective, always watching, always guiding Louis in ways that felt almost instinctive, like he understood his role long before anyone ever explained it to him. But this was different. This was something no older brother, no future king, no amount of royal training could shield him from. And yet, instead of pulling away, instead of retreating into himself, he stepped closer. That's what shocked everyone. Because in the days that followed, something subtle but undeniable began to shift. George started watching Louis more closely, not in a controlling way, but in a way that felt intentional, like he was constantly checking, constantly making sure everything was okay without saying it out loud. He adjusted himself around Louis, played what Louis wanted to play, moved at his pace, stayed near him, always. And if you weren't looking carefully, you might miss it. But the people inside that world, they noticed. They saw the way George instinctively filled the gaps, the way he quietly made space for Louis without being asked, the way he carried something invisible but undeniably heavy. And here's where it gets even more intense, because William and Catherine saw it too. And while most parents might feel pride in that kind of devotion, there was something else layered underneath it, concern. Because this wasn't just kindness, this was a child trying to take on something too big, and they knew it. So they stepped in, gently, carefully, making it clear that this wasn't George's burden to carry alone, that loving his brother didn't mean becoming responsible for his condition, that he was still allowed to be a child, allowed to laugh, allowed to not worry, even when everything felt uncertain. But here's the truth that no reassurance can fully erase. Once a child understands vulnerability like that, really understands it, there's no going back. And George, he understood. Because while the official line described Louis' condition as manageable, inside that house, that word didn't feel light. It didn't feel reassuring. It felt ongoing. It felt like something that doesn't end, just changes shape. Doctor appointments, therapies, adjustments, routine shifting quietly, permanently. And George was watching all of it. Every conversation, every subtle change, every moment his parents thought he might not notice. He noticed. And that's what makes this story so much bigger than a diagnosis. Because what's unfolding here isn't just about Louis. It's about the making of a king who was being shaped not by tradition, not by ceremony, but by something far more unpredictable. Emotion. Real, unfiltered, unavoidable emotion. And maybe that's the part that makes this so unsettling for those who have always believed the monarchy should remain untouched, distant, untouchable. Because what's happening behind those gates right now? It's human, messy, unscripted, and impossible to control. George is learning something that no royal handbook could ever teach him. That strength isn't about standing tall and hiding everything. Sometimes it's about sitting on the floor next to your little brother, not knowing what comes next and staying anyway. And as this quiet transformation continues, one thing is becoming impossible to ignore. This isn't just a family adapting to a challenge. This is a future king being reshaped in real time by fear, by love, by the one thing no crown can protect you from, reality. And what followed after that moment, after the tears, after the quiet collapse of composure, wasn't chaos. It was something far more unsettling. A slow, deliberate transformation that unfolded behind closed doors, away from cameras, away from headlines, in a space where even royalty couldn't escape the truth. Because while the world speculated, debated, and filled social media with theories, inside that home, something far more real was taking shape. A new rhythm, a new reality. And George, he was right at the center of it. Not by choice, but by instinct. Because once that protective switch flipped inside him, it didn't turn off. It couldn't. He began moving differently, not dramatically, not in ways that would draw attention, but in quiet, almost invisible shifts that revealed everything. He walked closer to Louis, matched his pace, waited for him without being asked, watched him constantly, not out of fear alone, but out of something deeper. Something that looked a lot like responsibility, but felt a lot like love trying to become control in a situation where control didn't exist. And that's where it gets complicated. Because for an 11-year-old boy, especially one raised in a world where duty is stitched into his identity from birth, the line between caring and carrying becomes dangerously thin. And insiders say George was starting to feel that weight. Not openly, not in ways that would alarm anyone immediately, but in the quiet ways children reveal pressure, becoming more serious, more attentive, less carefree. Because when you've seen vulnerability like that up close, when you've heard words like ongoing care and long-term management echo in conversations you weren't supposed to fully understand, something inside you shifts. You grow faster than you're meant to. And William and Catherine, they saw it happening. Every glance, every subtle adjustment, every moment George chose Louis over himself without even thinking about it. And this is where their response becomes just as powerful as the diagnosis itself. Because instead of letting that weight settle, instead of allowing George to quietly absorb it like generations before him might have been expected to, they interrupted it. They reminded him again and again that this wasn't his burden to fix. That being a brother didn't mean becoming a shield against everything. That love doesn't mean losing yourself. And that reassurance, it mattered. Because without it, the story could have gone very differently. But even with that support, even with that balance carefully maintained, there are things you can't unlearn. And George had already learned too much. He had seen the way schedules shifted, how conversations paused when he entered the room, then resumed in softer tones, how normal routines suddenly required planning, precision, attention. Nothing was chaotic, nothing was visibly broken, but everything had changed. And perhaps the most intense part of all this is that George is old enough to understand, but still young enough to feel it more deeply than he can process. He knows his brother isn't in immediate danger. He knows it's manageable, but he also knows it's not temporary. And that kind of knowledge, it lingers. It sits quietly in the background of everything, even in laughter, even in play, even in moments that are supposed to feel light. And yet, instead of pulling away from that discomfort, George leaned into it. That's what continues to surprise those watching closely, because there was no rebellion, no emotional shutdown, no withdrawal, just presence, consistent, unwavering presence. Sitting with Louis, playing with him, talking to him like nothing had changed while understanding that everything had. And Charlotte, she became something else entirely in this dynamic. Not loud, not reactive, but steady. observing everything, absorbing tension in her own way, adapting without making it visible. She treated Louis the same, refusing to let the diagnosis redefine him while quietly adjusting around the new reality just like George did, but differently. More balanced, less heavy. And in that contrast, the family found something unexpected: stability. Because while George carried, Charlotte grounded. And William and Catherine, they anchored everything, adjusting schedules, reducing public commitments, protecting moments that couldn't be replaced, school runs, dinners, bedtime conversations, things that in any other life might seem ordinary, but in this world became essential. Because when everything outside feels unpredictable, you hold tighter to what remains constant. And this is where the story shifts from emotional to quietly revolutionary. Because what's happening inside that household right now is not how the monarchy used to function. Not even close. There was a time when illness was hidden, when vulnerability was masked, when emotions were controlled, contained, never displayed. But this is something else. This is transparency within the family. This is a future king being allowed to feel, to ask questions, to cry, to not have all the answers. More care, more structure, more attention. And the family adapted, not by changing who he is, but by building around him in a way that keeps him exactly that, himself. And that might be the most powerful part of this entire story. Because despite everything, despite the pressure, the scrutiny, the constant presence of a world that wants details, answers, explanations, they chose something different. They chose to protect what matters most. Not the image, not the narrative, but the bond, the connection, the unspoken promise that no matter what changes, they face it together. And George, standing quietly in the middle of it all, is learning the most important lesson of his life. Not from a tutor, not from a protocol, but from experience. That leadership doesn't begin on a throne. It begins in moments like this. Moments where fear exists but doesn't win. Where uncertainty lingers but doesn't break you. Where love becomes the only thing strong enough to hold everything together. And maybe, just maybe, that's what will define him more than anything else. Not the crown, not the title, but the boy who once cried for his brother and chose to stay strong not by hiding it, but by holding on tighter.